This is BreakPoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Welcome to BreakPoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. Shane, we've been doing this now. You stepped in here from Warren, who stepped in for Ed Stetzer. We've been doing this here for a while. I'm not sure we had a busier week in your tenure, at least, than this past week. We got a lot of things to talk about, and it just kind of seemed to be one thing after another.
Yeah, this is the week I get to prove my mettle, John.
That's good. I'm glad you're taking it as a personal challenge. The only way I can think of to tackle this is to go day by day. So let's go back to last Sunday, which, of course, Super Bowl Sunday. Congratulations to the Kansas City Chiefs. Really happy to see a young quarterback. Seems to be a great kid, person of faith. And also his coach, good relationship there. One of the good guys of the NFL, has been around a long time. Clark and Tavia Hunt, the owners of the Chiefs, strong testimony for the Lord there in the throughout the playoffs and especially in the trophy ceremony. Great comeback win. You have no idea about any of these names or anything that I'm talking about. I understand.
I fell asleep there for a second, John. Although I should join President Trump in congratulating the great state of Kansas.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I would actually say something about that, but I've made that mistake on more than one time. Flying into Kansas City is like, well, where am I again? But that was pretty funny. You got to have fact check for Twitter. We know that's not been something that has been. Anyway, we'll keep going. We're going to get enough to the president. He dominated plenty of headlines this week. I want to go to the Super Bowl performance. Halftime performance. And here's why. Years ago, when Beyonce did the Super Bowl performance, 2013, I was so deeply bothered by it that I turned around and wrote a BreakPoint commentary, which I think is actually, in terms of the metrics that we have and how far these things go, whether it's through email or podcast or radio or the website, and then getting shared and picked up by newspapers and so on, which a lot of our commentaries do. Maybe the most far-reaching commentary of all time, and on Beyonce and the Super Bowl performance. Because, look, if there's one thing you're not allowed to do in pop culture, it's criticize Queen Bee, right? Or Queen Bey, or whatever you say. She's royalty. I mean, yeah, Queen Bey. There we go. Yeah, and she's royalty. There's no question about it in terms of pop music. But what passes for women's empowerment, and that's how that thing was hoisted upon us. What passes for female empowerment is exactly what men want. And one of the things I wrote then was, I'm not sure the wives of the husbands watching that Super Bowl performance felt very empowered. Well, here's the interesting thing. In the years since, there was a notable attempt to tone down the sensuality and sexuality of the halftime shows, right? I mean, you had different performers. Yet Lady Gaga pushed a couple lines, but nothing like she has done in concert. She was quite noticeably subdued, as she kind of has become off and on in her career. And then this past Sunday, so we're talking, 7 years later, with Shakira and Jennifer Lopez, took whatever Beyonce did and took it way beyond. I quoted in a BreakPoint commentary this past week, somebody who looking at Beyonce's performance said, I half expected a stripper pole to pop out of the stage. Well, guess what? On Sunday, that's exactly what happened.
Surprise.
It was, well, I guess I wasn't. I mean, everyone knew it was kind of headed back that direction when you put Shakira and J-Lo on the stage. But the thing I wanted to know, and I don't think a lot of people did, is that it's been 7 years since the Super Bowl really kind of tried this experiment. And the last time they did it, it didn't go well.
Yeah, it seemed like the sexual revolution was having an identity crisis there for a while, John, with the Me Too movement. There was serious pushback, not just against sexual harassment and violence, but against the objectification of women that sort of leads in that direction. I think there was an intuitive understanding on the part of even secular commentators and thinkers that if you treat women this way and you teach men to look at women this way, then it's inevitably going to lead to abuse, right? The consent thing is not a line that you can just draw in the sand at the very last second and say, okay, this far and no further. So there was this really big pushback, and you saw that manifested for a few years in the Super Bowl there. And now, 7 years hence, not only have we reverted, but we've taken it to the next level with the whole the stripper pole imagery.
No, it's exactly right. And I just want to reiterate something I said earlier, because this is the thing, that women's empowerment through the sexual revolution has always actually ended up serving men, you know? I mean, men get what they want, and they just have to work less to get it. They get free sexuality without having to actually woo or bed or anything like that a woman.
Yeah, we talked recently, too, about how men actually support abortion now at higher rates than women do. And that makes perfect sense, John. It's because men who want to exploit women, abortion is their best friend. It allows them to get rid of the consequences of their actions and not take responsibility.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't realize that's exactly the argument that the first wave feminists made about abortion. That's why people like Susan B. Anthony were pro-life and not pro-abortion, because they realized that it would be a get-out-of-jail-free card for men who then could get what they want without the consequences of it. The other, of course, victim, and I wrote about it this week, it was a commentary, basically went back to the Beyonce commentary and updated it and put it out again on Tuesday, and it went far and wide again. Because, again, a lot of people were just really, really concerned. We had a Super Bowl party over at the house. There was, couples, and you're watching it, and you're like, none of the kids can be in the room, and the dad shouldn't be in the room.
We had a church Super Bowl watch party, and I've never seen elders scramble so quickly to grab the remote control.
The remote, yeah, it's exactly right. And you just, again, the two people who are always victims of the sexual revolution are women and children. And both of those categories, this performance went beyond. I mean, you had not only then this stripper pole, not only a religious reference in Jennifer Lopez, but you also had children. And of course, the idea was to make it very Latino and talk about, make a kind of a sideswipe on the immigration policy and children's in cages. So then you actually have children in the performance watching the performance. So again, children exposed to sexuality at a brand new, at a very young age, and again, all of this is to be considered normal.
Our culture seems to want contradictory things in this respect. The entertainers in charge of the halftime show, for instance, seem to want women to be equal to men and be viewed more as sex objects at the same time, and those two things can't be true at the same time. It keeps churning out halftime shows with wardrobe malfunctions and stripper poles, despite that brief hiatus you mentioned. And it says to men and women both, on one hand, you're human beings with equal rights, and then on the other hand, this job, which women at their lowest points in their lives actually do, usually from like drug addictions or things like that, or under duress or desperation. This is something to indulge ourselves in and celebrate, an imagery that's empowering. Those two things are so contradictory.
And that was just Sunday, so let's go to Monday. Monday, of course, was the official opening of the 2020 election season, the campaigning hitting its first early peak in Iowa, where candidates have been eating a whole lot of fried food at the Iowa State Fair and, visiting, little diners in small little Iowa towns for a long time in preparation for the Iowa caucus. And everyone expected the story to be, who is going to take the early lead in this nomination. Although for the Republicans, Iowa is almost a guarantee that you're not going to get the nomination if you win Iowa on the GOP side. But if you win Iowa on the Democrat side, there's a little bit of a better chance. But that's not the results that we got. In fact, I'm not sure we still know the results.
Yeah, I think Pete Buttigieg pulled off a narrow victory over Bernie Sanders, and all of the Sanders fans are
it's
suspicious.
Friday here as we're having this conversation. Are 100%? I've been traveling back from the prayer breakfast through a bunch of snow. So did we actually get the 100%?
Yeah, John,
they're all in now.
As far as
early
I can tell,
morning.
Early this morning, that's what I saw, yeah.
Wow. So Pete Buttigieg is the winner, and Bernie Sanders coming in a close second. I mean, they blamed it on a failure of an app, right? And I'm thinking, like, the way the caucuses are done, like, don't you just kind of pick up the phone and say, hey, here's what we had at our place, and somebody pulls out a pad of paper and sums it all up? I think a lot of people are just really astonished that it took this long.
Well, all of us in Florida breathed a sigh of relief, John, because now we are no longer the most dysfunctional state when it comes to elections.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, look, Iowa had a bad week. You guys have had a bad decade. So I don't know if they've caught up with you guys yet.
I did see a really great, I think it was Babylon Bee. Maybe it was some other satire site like The Onion, where it said Iowa caucus results turn up in stomach of tiger shark fished up by Thai fishermen across the Pacific.
Yeah, it was really, really something. So here's the thing that I heard over and over this week as I spent a couple days in Washington, D.C. for the prayer breakfast, which is our story for as we get later on here in the program. But there's some real thought by many that it just didn't make any sense, right? I mean, you do have certainly a failure of the app is what it's being blamed on. But at the same time, to take that long to kind of get these results in. And all of this is kind of underscoring two things. Number one is, did the impeachment hearings hurt Joe Biden more than maybe the media thought it had? Listening to a lot of news coverage from the New York Times and so on. I mean, you're talking about Iowa, and I think one of the things that's worth saying is that Iowa Democrats aren't necessarily representative of national Democrats, and that's one of the challenges that the Democratic Party faces by putting so much weight on this early caucus. But it's far less diverse than they're going to find delegates and superdelegates being in other parts of the country. But you also have this reality that a lot of them brought up, like, yeah, I don't think he's innocent. And so that's one question. And then the second question is, there's a real concern, and this is something that Joe Biden has pointed out, if the Democrats become known as the party of socialism. Now, the Republicans call them the party of socialism because so many of their things seem to rhyme with socialism. But now you have a candidate who has self-selected that title, that label for himself, and as we've seen with President Trump, that becomes the label of the party, like it or not. That's how it happens. It's whoever the candidate is becomes kind of the one who defines the party. And so, is America ready for a Bernie Sanders? Are the Democrats ready for a Bernie Sanders? And I'm not sure. From Iowa, it's interesting that there's an awful lot of people that are, and then the power players may not be, and that's the question we're going to have going forward.
Well, let's not forget, John, that Mayor Pete represents a radical departure from the history of the Democratic Party as well. He's an openly gay candidate and quite radical on a lot of those issues. In fact, he was recently at a town hall, I believe, he was unwilling to sort of accommodate the views of a pro-choice Democrat. And that, to me, shows that the party as a whole, and not just Bernie Sanders and the Bernie bros, has lurched radically left in recent years. The Republican Party has undergone a change where it's become much less of a sort of big business, free trade party to a much more party of the little guy and the factory worker sort of thing. It's more populist now than it was. But I don't think that departure the Republican Party has made from its recent history is quite as radical as the Democrats' departure has been, especially on issues like sexuality and abortion.
Yeah, and that is a really interesting observation because, again, we're talking about Iowa, right? We're talking about the middle of the country. Now, we're not talking about anything on the coast. Although the academic elites in Iowa tend to be the education folks tend to be more liberal in Iowa than other places. What's really going to be interesting is when it goes to a place like South Carolina, whether Buttigieg's early momentum is going to translate. I mean, because he's polling so poorly among African Americans, and this kind of underscores too, I think, the other fear that I hear a lot about, and I heard a lot about this past week, is just not fear or just kind of analysis, whether when a candidate is named for the Democrats, whether there's really going to be an ability to coalesce around that candidate. Will the Bernie folks get around to Joe Biden? Will African-American Democratic voters get around Pete Buttigieg? I mean, he's not just polling bad, he's polling abysmal with that group. And South Carolina is going to be a big test of that one. So it's interesting to see this going forward. And all of this, that just it kind of sucked the air out of the room. I mean, the other thing, I was talking to a congressional staffer this week, and he kind of lives and breathes this stuff, and he goes, "I just can't imagine putting 2 or 3 years into a state to get some momentum coming out of Iowa, and then to have it all sucked out of the room because of that whatever incompetence or whatever." and then, the story then be kind of overrun by all the other things that happened during the week. And there was a lot of other things that happened during the week, which we'll get to here. You're listening to BreakPoint This Week. Come to breakpoint.org, and if you click on the link for this program, we will put there links to all the different articles and things that we talked about on today's show. We'll be right back. For Shane Morris, I'm John Stonestreet. Stay with us.
We invite you to visit breakpoint.org, and while you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of books and other resources. And you can find links to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
Back on BreakPoint This Week, John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. Well, we got 2 days for half the program here, Shane, so we're going to have to pick up the pace. Tuesday, of course, was the State of the Union, and there was a high mark for the president this week. I think it was that one in a lot of ways, but also a place where there was an awful lot of drama. I mean, good heavens, as he walks in, the question of whether or not he intended or missed to shake her hand. He didn't shake the vice president's hand. It wasn't really clear. She, of course, seemed to have planned to tear up the speech, which she did as soon as he was done. And before he walked out, when the president walks out, there is no cameras on, the Speaker of the House. But Nancy Pelosi has a camera on her as the speech is finishing up, and that's how she chose to time it. So there was a good bit of calculation there, as we know that the speaker is prone to do. So first, content of the State of the Union, a couple things worth mentioning. Certainly, first, he did a good bit of celebration of the judges that the Republicans have been putting into place, a lot of them, including 2 Supreme Court justices. Also very clear again, and this has become one of those repeated things over and over and over, this late-term abortion ban that he is backing. And also, not only that, but accompany that with a good bit of funding and an encouragement to increase our medical capabilities for expectant mothers, and had some, really interesting moments too. I mean, I think, as a TV guy, he had 4 kind of big reveals, through the speech, including one of our deployed military coming home to a wife and 2 kids. I mean, it was like, this is TV, right? I mean, that's what he was doing. But let's talk about the content of the State of the Union first before we get to Nancy Pelosi. What did you think about the content?
Well, to me, I agree. This was Trump's high point for the week, John. I mean, I looked up his speech writers, actually. I looked up their names. I forget who they were, and nobody knows or cares who they are, really. Apologies to the speech writers, but they did a great job, and I knew that there were some, sharp minds behind him, especially the closing, where he sort of reminded us that America is a great country and it's a great place to live, despite our flaws. It was Trump, in a sense, but it was the best of Trump, and I appreciated that, especially given what came later in the week. The high point to me was the willingness to call out abortion. I know it's sort of a symbolic gesture at this point, but John, I'm really persuaded that part of the way the pro-life movement advances is not necessarily through getting votes in Congress only, or state legislatures, but also through making a demonstration or a reminder of what we're really talking about here. And things like pain-capable acts, which is what he endorsed, put those who are defending abortion in a really tough spot. It forces them to, to defend the indefensible, to remind people, just even talking about it, I think is a point for the pro-life cause. And that's why it was worth mentioning in the State of the Union, despite the fact that Congress is divided. So that was a really big high point for me. I think the one that stuck out in my mind.
And yet at the same time, in the state of Virginia, we saw state efforts to really roll back pro-life protections. As Olivia Gons-Turner says, she's the president of Virginia Society for Human Life. We've watched the General Assembly rip away over 30 years of pro-life law, which underscores 2 things. Number one is when it comes to life, as you said, politics isn't everything, but it actually does matter. Secondly, what happens from the White House matters, and also what happens from the State House matters. And we're seeing that, and kind of as Roe v. Wade looks vulnerable for the first time in 40 years. This is something we've been talking a lot about at the Colson Center, is this tension between federal law and state law is only going to get greater. All right, well, let's move to the next story. Nancy Pelosi rips up the State of the Union speech. I don't really want to dwell on that as much as I want to dwell on. From there, let's just say it this way, it escalated quickly. So that happens Tuesday night. On Wednesday, late evening, Trump is acquitted on all charges. We had a very kind of dramatic, what do you want to say, performance or speech and decision by Mitt Romney to vote for one of the articles of impeachment, not for the other. And so that created all kinds of, that also escalated the tension. And to Thursday morning. So Thursday morning, I'm in Washington, D.C. with a couple thousand other folks, and we're there at the National Prayer Breakfast. The speaker, Arthur Brooks, delivered something that was really, really powerful, and I want to get to that in just a second. But I tell you what, there was a palpable anger and hurt and tension in the room. I mean, that the rhetoric heats up to the point where it does get personal. But this was really, really personal, Shane. I mean, you could see it coming in when the president entered the room. Let me back up. When the vice president and his wife entered the room, Nancy Pelosi shook her hand. She's most of the time much more about decorum than the president is. When the president entered, he didn't even go down to that side of the table. She did stand and applaud, although during his speech, she was very much uncomfortable. You could see her talking out loud and using hand gestures at times. But Trump didn't hold back. Now, I will say he held back more at the National Prayer Breakfast than he did at his speech later on in the morning, where he talked about it was kind of the post-acquittal press conference. But it was a stunningly angry stage. It really was. And you had a Democrat and a Republican congressman co-hosting the event. And you could just see it. It was awkward. That was the word that everyone said. This was awkward.
Yeah, John, I think this really gets to what frustrates me most about this president. Every time I begin to appreciate a policy accomplishment or a position he's taken, like in the State of the Union, chief among them, his pro-life stances, by the way, he goes and does something like this. He acts like, frankly, a swaggering bully instead of the Christian man he now claims to be. And I think there's something to be said also, aside from the glaring contradiction with Arthur Brooks' speech, which was entitled Loving Your Neighbor, right, which is about his recent book by the same title. Aside from that, John, I think it's probably a poor long-term strategy on Trump's part. There's something to be said for being gracious in victory. There's something to be said for bringing the country together and saying, all right, well, we put that behind us. The impeachment process is over. Now I want to remind everyone that I'm the president of all of America. All Americans are, my countrymen. I want to go to both sides of the table, both sides of the aisle. I want to bring us together. And instead, Trump sort of doubled down on the nanny, nanny, boo-boo, victory lap posture. And it just doesn't look good. And I don't think it's a good strategy either.
And let me take a little bit of a different take. I mean, not to say that he didn't directly contradict the speech. That was a great speech. He did. Okay, so, and not to justify at all the behavior which was there. I'm not sure this one was as much gloating as it was just anger and hurt. In other words, he made two specific references about people who say they pray for me and don't. That's clearly about Nancy Pelosi. Made a specific reference about using religion. Everyone kind of took that as kind of a shot at Mitt Romney. Right. And you know what? I think he came in that way. All right. So here's my take. I was down to the left. I could kind of see the stage. It was hard to see. There's a lot of people in the room, didn't have great seats. But I'm sitting there, and he comes in when he's announced and holds up the headlines. That was kind of the famous. Somebody had put in New York Times there, and it says Trump acquitted. And you're kind of thinking, wow, he just did that. And yes, he is gloating at that point. And then Arthur Brooks makes this talk, and he makes a very profound statement. He says, it's not real. See, tolerance is a bogus solution because it acts like we don't really disagree. But the trick is not finding the humanity in those who we agree with. It's in those who we disagree with. And and getting rid of scorn. He was very much talking about, look, the problem isn't disagreement, the problem is scorn. And it was very much in the tradition of the National Prayer Breakfast, where at one point you had Mother Teresa speaking to Bill Clinton about life. And you had Eric Metaxas speaking to Barack Obama about abortion as well. And you basically have these speakers that say, okay, what does the nation need to know? And Arthur Brooks has done such interesting research. He's very much like a kind of a more academic Malcolm Gladwell to me, where he just kind of thinks differently about things. And so he brings up this issue of scorn. And you could see when the president got up, it was kind of like, oh, I know where I was going this morning, and kind of that gloating thing. But he really struggled at the beginning to kind of say, what do I do about this? Now, he famously said, Arthur, I'm not sure I agree with you. He didn't say it, though, out of it was a moment of real discomfort, Shane. I mean, I actually think, okay, just looking at it, And then, I mean, listen, for all credit, he starts rolling, and then he rolls, and then, of course, it was long forgotten by the time he did his press conference later on in the morning. But he looked like he was struggling with some of the points. In fact, at one point in this Arthur Brooks speech, he kind of says, now, how do we do this? Here's 3 ways to do it. And it's like Trump leaned forward and took notes. Now, whether he was taking notes or correcting his speech in light of it, I don't know. But it looked to me like he was actually thinking about this stuff, and it made him really uncomfortable. And, of course, no, he didn't go there. But it really came from almost like a guy who had been kind of chastened and was still kind of trying to defend himself. You know, you remember getting in trouble like that as a teenager, right, Shane? And you're like, but I'm justified. Yeah. You do know what I'm talking about, though? It's like, I'm justified in how I feel, and so we justify the bad behavior, even though somebody's calling us out on it. Does that make sense? That's my best take on what it is. Now, I'm not justifying anything he did. I just think it came much more from a place of anger and hurt and trying to kind of, but I'm justified in this, than it did from a place of just kind of, you know, what do you call it, hubris or just arrogance?
Yeah, I don't know, or a lack of understanding that there's any other way to do things.
Oh, yeah,
or
absolutely.
Practice in doing it another way.
Yeah. And he is. Yeah, he's not practiced in doing it any other way. And I agree with you that he lost. I think on Thursday, this was a lost opportunity, because even a lot of us that were there, you know, who are so thankful for the way that things that the Trump administration has accomplished for life, for religious freedom in the judiciary, one after another after another. There's just a lot of people that were just like, he just didn't need to do that, you know? And we wish that the grace of Christ at that level, you know, would surround him and get a hold of his heart. And, you know, it was one of those moments where there was like a crack, and then it was, oh man, where is it?
No. Yeah. I mean, John, it's, God bless Arthur Brooks for that. And I should mention that we share the same alma mater, Thomas Edison State College. But I think it's worth reminding Christians in particular that we don't have to defend this. You know, we can speak truth to power and try to, you know, even persuade someone like Donald Trump that there's another way of doing business. We don't have to say, oh, he was justified in doing this, even if we can understand, you know, why he feels the way he feels, regardless of how much we appreciate the stuff that President Trump has done in office, especially, you know, his pro-life judicial appointments and economic policies and so on and so forth. Christians who voted for him in 2016, I constantly hear this mantra that, well, we held our noses, you know, we did this because it was a tortured decision between two really not so great options. And I think that's true. Then we ought to be willing to say, look, Trump, you messed up on this one. It's still okay to think that and appreciate his good decisions. But I'm seeing a lot of people sort of edge in the direction of unconditional and uncompromising praise for the president, even when he comes out and does something that's just so small and indefensible, like this speech at the prayer breakfast was.
Well, and that's a sign that we are living in this moment, right? And to live out of the biblical story means to be able to call balls and strikes, to think about success in different sorts of ways, to not kind of do this, you know, all or nothing purity test when it comes to it, and just move forward. And I would say 2 things as we close. Number 1 is check out Arthur Brooks' speech. It really was, I think, a powerful speech and had some very, very important things to say for this cultural moment. And the second thing I'll say is, in other times and in other places, it wouldn't have sounded so revolutionary. And this is one of the things that strikes me about Proverbs, and really his speech was really right out of Proverbs, and how to, you know, talk to others, how to treat others with whom you disagree, how to, you know, so on. And you realize that in some times and in some places, Proverbs sounds like revolutionary truths. And honestly, it's just kind of like simple things like, you know what? Don't walk with fools. You know what? The soft answer turns away wrath. And you kind of like, man, that's not rocket surgery, right? I mean, that's pretty straightforward sort of stuff. But in a time like ours, this is the power of Proverbs, which is probably a good call for all of us to spend more time in Proverbs. And we'll close out the program on today. We just about made it through the whole week. Hopefully nothing else happens on Friday that we'll miss, but I'm sure we'll have plenty more to talk about next week. You've been listening to BreakPoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. Come to breakpoint.org, and you can subscribe to our emails as well as the BreakPoint podcast. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.